Imagine child, 8 years old, sitting across from a man in a gray Soviet uniform, being taught not how to read, but how to kill. Not in a story, not in a film, in a real classroom, inside a real building, buried deep inside the Soviet Union, where the outside world had no idea what was happening behind those walls. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. And what you are about to hear will change the way you think about childhood, war, and the lengths a government will go to in order to protect its power. It is 1943. The war on the Eastern Front is bleeding the Soviet Union dry. Stalin has lost millions of men. Entire armies have been swallowed whole by the German advance. The NKVD, the feared Soviet secret police, is desperate. And in that desperation, an idea is born. Not just a weapon, a program. One so classified that even senior Soviet officials were denied access to its files. A program that took the most vulnerable human beings on Earth and turned them into instruments of death. The program had no single official name in public records. Western intelligence agencies who later pieced together fragments of its existence called it by various code names. But inside the walls of the NKVD's Special Directorate, it was known simply as the Berkut Program, the Golden Eagle. And its recruits were never older than 12. The origins trace back to a single man, Pavel Sudoplatov. Born in 1907 in Melitopol, Ukraine, Sudoplatov had joined Soviet intelligence as a teenager himself, recruited at just 15 years old. By the time the Second World War consumed Europe, he was one of the most dangerous men alive. He had personally assassinated Ukrainian nationalist leader Yevhen Konovalets in 1938 by delivering a bomb disguised as a box of chocolates. He had orchestrated operations across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And now, sitting inside the Lubyanka building in Moscow in the winter of 1943, he was designing something that had never been attempted in modern warfare: a structured, state-run program to weaponize children. His logic was as cold as the Moscow winter. Children could move through spaces adults could not. They aroused no suspicion behind enemy lines. A small boy carrying a loaf of bread through a German checkpoint would never be searched the way a man of fighting age would be. A girl selling flowers outside a Wehrmacht officer's hotel could memorize his schedule, his contacts, his movements. And if trained correctly, they could do far more than just watch. The first recruitment wave happened in the orphanages. The Soviet Union in 1943 was overflowing with orphans. The war had made millions of them overnight. Children whose parents had been killed by German bombs, by execution squads, by starvation in besieged cities. The NKVD found them there, hollow-eyed, grieving, with no one to protect them and nowhere to go. Recruiters posing as welfare officials would identify the most psychologically resilient among them. Not the most aggressive, not the most physically capable, the most resilient. The children who had seen horror and had not broken. These children were transferred to what were called special education facilities. On paper, they were boarding schools, and in some ways, they were. The children slept in dormitories. They ate regular meals, better meals than most Soviet citizens were getting during wartime rationing. They attended lessons, but the lessons were nothing like any other school in the world. Language training began immediately: German, Finnish, Polish, Romanian. Not just conversational language, but regional dialects, slang, the kind of speech patterns that would allow the child to pass as a local in an occupied territory. They were taught the geography of enemy-controlled cities in microscopic detail, the layout of streets, the location of Gestapo offices, the shift patterns of German guard rotations. And then came the other training. Physical conditioning began at age 9 for most recruits. Not the kind of physical training you see in military films, not long runs and push-ups. It was something far more specific: close quarters survival, how to move silently across different surfaces, how to slow your breathing, how to remain perfectly still for hours at a time. And by age 10, how to neutralize a human target with nothing but your hands. The psychological conditioning is where the true darkness of this program reveals itself. Because the NKVD understood something that modern neuroscience has since confirmed, that the child's brain is uniquely vulnerable to conditioning, traumatic bonding, loyalty engineering, the systematic dismantling of moral resistance. Children were not ordered to do things. They were guided slowly, methodically, into choosing to do them. By the time a child in the Berkut program was 11 years old, the concept of taking a human life was not a horror to be overcome. It had been reframed through hundreds of hours of psychological reinforcement as an act of service, of love, of protecting the motherland that had given them food and warmth when the world had abandoned them. The first known operational deployment of Berkut Program children happened in 1944. A 12-year-old boy, known in the files only by his operational code name, Zolotoy, meaning golden, was inserted into German-occupied Minsk. His cover identity was that of a local street child, orphaned and homeless. His mission was to identify the movements of a specific Gestapo officer responsible for the deaths of dozens of Soviet operatives. For 3 weeks, he lived on the streets of Minsk. He befriended German soldiers who gave him food. He mapped the officer's schedule with the precision of a trained adult intelligence asset. And then, on a Tuesday evening in October 1944, he completed his mission. The Gestapo officer was found dead the following morning. The case was never solved. Zolotoy was extracted back across Soviet lines within 48 hours. He was 12 years old, but here is where the story turns in a direction that even the most hardened historians find difficult to see. Because not all of these children came back. The NKVD files, portions of which were declassified in fragments after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, contain references to what operatives called the silent losses. Children who were deployed and never returned. Some were captured by German forces. Some were executed when their covers were blown. Others simply vanished. And the files suggest that some of those who were captured were not extracted. The program could not afford the exposure. They were left behind, 12-year-olds, in German custody, alone. The moral gravity of that fact is almost impossible to absorb. After the war ended in 1945, what happened to the surviving children of the Berkut program? This is a question that Soviet authorities went to extraordinary lengths to prevent anyone from asking. The children who survived were not celebrated. They were not given medals. They were transferred quietly under false identities into standard Soviet orphanages and state-run facilities. Their records were sealed. In many cases, their very names were changed. They were scattered across the Soviet Union, from Moscow to Vladivostok, their identities buried under layers of bureaucratic camouflage. They grew up. They became adults. They lived ordinary Soviet lives, factory workers, engineers, teachers, and they never spoke about what they had done, not because they were legally prohibited, though they were, but because there was no framework in human experience for what they had lived through, no language for it, no one who could possibly understand. Pavel Sudoplatov himself was arrested in 1953, shortly after Stalin's death, accused of being part of a conspiracy connected to the infamous doctor's plot. He was imprisoned in Vladimir's Central Prison for 15 years. When he was released, he was a broken man physically, nearly blind, but mentally intact. He wrote his memoirs in secret during the 1970s and 1980s. They were finally published in 1994, 3 years after the Soviet Union dissolved. In those memoirs, he made oblique references to special wartime programs involving what he called non-standard assets. He never used the word children. He never described the Berkut program by name. But for intelligence historians who knew what to look for, the references were unmistakable. The fragments of declassified NKVD files that emerged through the 1990s confirmed what researchers had long suspected. Between 1943 and 1945, somewhere between 200 and 400 children passed through facilities connected to the Berkut program. The exact number remains unknown. The full operational files, if they still exist, remain classified in Russian Federal Security Service archives to this day. Requests by historians and journalists to access these files have been denied without explanation, consistently, for over 30 years. Think about that. 80 years after the end of the Second World War, the Russian government is still protecting these secrets. There are people alive today in their 80s and 90s who were those children, who sat in those classrooms, who were sent behind enemy lines before they had finished growing, who carried the weight of what they did across 8 decades of life in silence, in a world that never knew they existed. Some of them may have had children of their own, grandchildren, people who had no idea that the quiet old man or woman in their family had once been one of the most covert operatives in the most secretive intelligence apparatus in human history. We talk about the cost of war in numbers, casualties, territory, resources, but the Berkut Program forces us to confront a cost that has no number assigned to it. The cost paid by children who were given no choice, who were shaped by grief and hunger and state machinery into something the adults around them needed them to be, and who then had to spend the rest of their lives carrying that alone. History is full of monsters, but sometimes the most disturbing thing history shows us is not a monster. It is a system, rational, organized, operating with clear logic and defined objectives. A system that looked at a grieving 8-year-old child and saw an asset. And the most chilling question of all is not whether this happened. The documents confirm that it did. The most chilling question is whether it ever truly stopped.